So good afternoon, everyone. Just make sure everyone knows where you are. You are at Red Bud session about climate. So I always go to the wrong room. So that's the way for us to be sure where to go. So our first presenter is Hemali Oza. Wow, I try. And household energy and water resource disruption and coping strategies during floods and droughts in Kenya.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hemali Oza, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Richmond, 2 months into that position, so I'm very excited. Thank you. Sorry? Okay, so today I'm going to be sharing some of our quantitative findings from a mixed methods study conducted in Kenya on the impacts of floods and droughts on energy and water in Homa Bay County, Kenya. So we know climate-driven environmental disturbances like floods and droughts are growing in frequency and intensity. Between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause about 250,000 additional deaths per year due to things like malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and heat stress. Floods and droughts impact access to clean and reliable energy and safe water, which have implications for waterborne diseases, dehydration, and respiratory conditions, and much, much more, as many of us already know. So this idea of climate resilience has emerged in the past several decades as this idea that households and communities should have the ability to minimize damage and adapt to an ever-changing environment. It's about bouncing back and ideally bouncing forward. And this idea of resilience is great in theory, but we don't always capture if what we think is resilient is potentially maladaptation or maybe some form of survival. So that is actually increasing potentially the risk of poor health outcomes. For example, using surface water sources during a drought to ensure access to water. So today I'll share some of our results that really tell the story of when there is a disruption in access to resources like energy and water during floods and droughts, households may substitute resources when lower quality alternatives are available that pose health risks. So our team was particularly interested in studying this in the Greater Horn of Africa region, specifically in Kenya, that is pretty climate vulnerable, one of the most in the world. We conducted a mixed methods cross-sectional study within Kenya to understand the impacts of droughts and floods on access to energy for lighting, cooking fuels, and drinking water. So this was a much larger project funded by SIF, collaborators with SNV and GAIN, with several parts including a stakeholder engagement process. My colleague Emily Ogutu also led the qualitative portion of this study, and she actually presented those findings earlier this week. And then, of course, the portion of the study that I'll be sharing today is the cross-sectional quantitative component that focused specifically on Homa Bay County in Kenya. So again, we were interested in understanding how floods and droughts impact access to energy for lighting, cooking fuels, and drinking water, and what households switch to when there is this disruption. Specifically, we aim to generate county-level estimates of access to these resources under normal conditions, so no droughts, no floods. Then we aim to generate county-level estimates on the proportion of households that experience a disruption in their access to these three resources during floods and then during droughts as well. Next, we also wanted to understand what alternative sources households shifted to when there was this disruption during these floods or droughts. And finally, we compared the risk of using unclean energy for lighting and cooking and unimproved water sources between normal times and flood times and normal times and drought times. Ultimately, we used these findings to inform points of entry for resilience building. So a bit about the methods. So for the quantitative study, we conducted a cross-sectional population-based structured household survey in Homa Bay County, Kenya. We recruited a random sample of households employing structured questionnaires among primary caregivers 18 years of age or older that resided in households with at least one child under the age of 5. And that specific inclusion criteria was more so related to another part of the larger study. The survey was conducted by our wonderful enumerators in the local language of Doluo. So we used a multi-stage cluster stratified random sampling approach. We randomly selected 20 sublocations within the county. And then we selected a community for each of those sublocations. So here you can see Emily explaining the snake sampling approach to our community guides that graciously aided our enumerators throughout the communities when we were collecting household data. So to produce the county level estimates for Homa Bay, we applied a design weight for each participating household calculated as the inverse probability of selection. These survey weights were then used to generate the weighted population totals, proportions, and standard errors for our key research questions. And then to compare the risk of using unclean or unimproved sources between normal times, so no floods, no droughts, and then times of floods and times of droughts, we used weighted generalized estimating equations, or GEEs, to produce risk ratios accounting for clustering at the household level and controlling for household socioeconomic status and the arid versus non-arid region designation. So we classified energy for cooking and lighting as clean or unclean, and then drinking water as improved or unimproved based on the WHO established definitions. Just to give a little bit about the survey questions we asked, so this was kind of the approach that we used. So we asked, what is your main source? Is it consistent? Have you faced a flood or drought in the past year? If it was yes, did the last flood or drought disrupt your access to these resources? And then if yes, what did you switch to when there was that disruption? So moving on to the results section, for objective 1, we wanted to first understand access under normal conditions. We estimated, based on household reporting, a high proportion of households experiencing inconsistent access. So again, these are the county level estimates that 59.3% of households lacked consistent access to energy for lighting, 60.4% lacked consistent access to cooking fuels, and then 59.7% lacked consistent access to drinking water. We estimated 46.2% of households faced a flood in the past year, and 70.2% faced a drought in the past year at the time of the survey. Okay, so now let's take a look at energy for lighting and floods. So we estimate of the households that faced a flood in the past year, over 70% faced a disruption during that last flood. So these sets of figures that I'm presenting show the breakdown of sources during normal times and then during the disturbance time, just of households that indicated facing that disturbance. So here it's lighting sources over normal and then flood conditions, with the green colors indicating clean sources and then the red colors showing unclean sources that have some sort of emission associated with their use. So there was a large shift away from solar home systems, as we see here, and a bit of an increase in some of those unclean sources. These houses were significantly more likely to use unclean lighting sources during floods compared to normal conditions. So now looking at droughts and lighting, just under a quarter of households faced a disruption during droughts. We did see a similar shift away towards solar home systems, and households were more likely to use unclean lighting sources during droughts compared to normal conditions. But one thing to note here that there is a large proportion still using generally clean lighting sources. So now looking at cooking fuels and floods. So 83% of households experienced a disruption to their access to cooking fuels during the last flood. For both normal times and flood times, we see a large reliance on unclean cooking fuels and a shift towards charcoal, and interestingly, a very small shift towards LPG during floods. So households were marginally less likely to use unclean cooking fuels during floods compared to normal conditions, likely due to that slight increase in LPG use. So something to look into further as a potential resilience building strategy. So now looking at cooking and droughts, so about 16% experienced disruption in cooking fuel access during droughts. There was a small shift towards charcoal use, but again, we see the trend of the reliance on unclean cooking fuels overall, both in normal times and drought times. So we didn't see much of a change in the risk of using unclean fuels here. Okay, so now looking at drinking water. So we estimate over 40% faced a disruption to their main drinking water source during the last phase flood. Maybe not surprising that we saw a large increase in rainwater collection during floods. But it's good to point out this actually meant that the households were 33% less likely to use unimproved water sources during flood conditions. And I'll use this interesting finding as an example of where the qualitative part of this mixed approach study that I mentioned earlier really comes in handy to provide some of the context around these quantitative findings. So because what we did find is that communities really do utilize heavy rainfall as a time to save water that they can then use later when water is scarce. But many, we found through the qualitative findings that many felt they didn't have the appropriate ways to store the water immediately or for a longer period of time. So this is helpful when thinking about points of entry for resilience. So now looking at droughts, we estimate just under 60% of households that faced a drought in the past year faced a disruption in their drinking water access during that time. So we saw a large shift towards surface water, which of course, had implications for the risk of using unimproved water sources during droughts as compared to normal conditions. So here we really see that shift towards a lower quality source. So one of the really unique aspects of this work is that it's the data itself. So we didn't just ask households what their main source of lighting or cooking or drinking water was. We also asked how those sources changed when they did experience their last flood or their last drought, to really understand when there is some sort of failure or some sort of breakdown during these disturbances, what do they turn to? So that kind of data is not frequently reported, and it helps us to see not just what people use, but how they adapt when the system fails. So what we found is that when access breaks down, households often shift from higher quality to lower quality alternatives. These substitutions, they fill that short-term gap, but carry serious health, environmental risks. At the same time, they reveal potential entry points for resilience, like that increased use of rainwater harvesting during flood times. Ultimately, like what we've been hearing in the recent plenary sessions, the takeaway is that resilience planning needs to account for operation under stress, not just access when everything is normal. We also need to think about having systems that have redundancy built in. So I want to thank our collaborators, as well as the households that graciously agreed to participate in our study. I also want to thank our funders, SIF, and then I also want to note that part of this work was supported by a grant from the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. And with that, I thank you for listening and welcome any questions.
So you probably know that this room is big, so we need people to ask questions in the mic, please, because otherwise it's not being recorded. So if you want to ask questions, please. Thank you. First question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Maybe it's the end of the conference, and this is a really obvious or boring question, but you presented proportions, and I was wondering if you also tracked like total amounts of consumption. So if, just looking at the shift, for example, in use of fuel, like wood for fuel, were people just doing that because they couldn't get out to access the wood, and therefore the proportions shifted, but they were overall accessing less and like had less energy access. And then for drinking water, shifting away from surface water during droughts, generally obvious, but did that mean they were also consuming less water? Did you think about the impacts on resilience or recovery with like potential for reduced volumes consumed or used?
So to the last part, that would have been a really great thing to collect. We did not collect data on that. There is a lot of like the nuances that you're getting at around, you know, there is this adaptation happening, they're switching to different sources, but obviously there's nuances in exactly how they're using that potentially new source as well. Some of those nuances definitely did come out in our qualitative work as well. So that the qualitative paper I'm really excited about is under review, and then this one is under preparation as well. But I'm happy to talk after to kind of understand a little bit more of the nuances. That didn't come out necessarily in the quantitative portion, but the qualitative speaks a little bit more about those nuances.
Thank you.
Last question.
Is that okay?
No,
Okay.
last question.
Really great talk, and I really love this intersection of energy and water. I was curious, in some of the work that I've done in sub-Saharan Africa related to this, we see a lot of like fuel stacking. So even at a given point in time, right, they're going to use multiple fuel sources already, or they might even use multiple water sources at a given time. But you're kind of just, like, the way it was presented, it was like, here's before a climate event, here's after. Did you capture if they were using kind of like stacking of things at either time point?
Yeah, and again, this is another thing that I would have loved to capture in this quantitative data, and we definitely like do see a little bit more of, you know, I can't always afford, you know, this type of energy source, but I can supplement it with this, and that those nuances definitely do come out in the qualitative data. And I'm sorry I'm not able to answer your question with the quantitative data, but I think like to the point I made earlier, you know, we have this quantitative data that tells a story, and then you take the qual data, which is the beauty of these mixed methods approaches. But again, happy to talk more about the qualitative data as well.
Thank you. Next presenter is Emory. Seasonal impact on water infrastructure, availability, quality, and source selection in Ethiopia, Ghana, and Uganda. Let me find it here. Which one is yours? Let's just present more than it's gonna work. Yep. It's over there.
It's the end of the week and I've almost lost my voice. Okay, so I'll have to just whisper into the microphone. My name is Anna. I work with the Aquaya Institute, and I'm happy to present this work on seasonal impacts of water infrastructure, availability, quality, source selection in sub-Saharan Africa. I will say that others have done a lot of the actual analytical modeling, so if you have really detailed questions, I may not be able to answer them, but I will do my best. All right, so I love that this is coming after the plenary today about climate, and your presentation is great. So obviously we know that climate change and extreme weather events are increasing in the world. And we see there was a comment in the plenary about how, you know, we know these things, but there's actually a lack of data around them. And so, you know, this evidence remains limited, even though we sort of know that there are seasonal impacts of availability and quality. And further, you know, and I think the last speaker spoke to this too, that households may make difficult trade-offs when faced with, you know, dry season shortages or things like that. So that's why this study, we aim to look at these things in particular. We also realize that seasonal definitions vary quite wildly in the literature. So when you look at the WASH literature of people who are doing this work, sometimes people say, March is a dry season because everybody says it's a dry season. So we were also interested to look at sort of more of an empirical approach to that. So our research questions were, again, how does seasonality impact water availability and quality in these study settings? And second, how does it affect the drivers for household public water source selection? So the data comes from a large longitudinal water quality monitoring program, which looks at data across 7 districts in 3 countries. And so this is repeated visits up to 6 times between 2022 and 2025. And so we've collected data in both wet seasons and dry seasons, and have almost 2,000 unique water points that include over 7,000 visits. So this data set was, again, repeated visits. We also sample households within those areas where the water points are. So we have almost 7,000 household visits, at the same times. And at each time, we also have surveys and E. coli results. So speaking a little bit about the definitions of seasons, so we used a definition from Liebman, 2012. So this is looking at actually how do you define the date that the wet season begins and ends. So the definition is when daily precipitation consistently exceeds the local daily average, and then it ends when precipitation systematically drops below that value. So let me show you a graph, it might make more sense. So this is from that paper. So again, let's say you're starting in the dry season and you have your daily precipitation and you're subtracting out that average, so you're gonna keep dropping. And then when you hit the bottom, it's gonna reverse direction. So that is defined as the beginning of your wet season. And then as you keep going along, you're gonna hit this inflection point at the top, and then that'll kick you back into the dry season. So to do this with our data, we used CHIRP's data, which is publicly available, and that's rainfall estimates for specific districts where we're working, so geographically relevant. And we looked at a 20-year average as that average value, and then daily estimates during the full years that we collected our data. So here's just an example of one of the districts that has a very clear rainy season. So this one was simple. This is rainfall within each month over the 20 years. And so on the right, these are just some examples of dates. So we see it varies, right, from year to year. It might vary up to a month or more. And then here's another quick example of one of our districts actually has two seasons. Right, so we couldn't use that first definition, so we modified that with sort of a different definition. I won't get into the details, but you can ask me later. Okay, so then we defined our seasons, and then our additional analyses for the two questions. So looking at availability and quality, we used generalized estimating equations. So again, looking at the odds of water availability and free from contamination. We clustered at the water point level to account for those repeated visits, and adjusted for a few other variables like the district, the type of water points, if it was institutional or community, et cetera. And then the second research question, we used a decision model, and this was to kind of model the revealed preferences from households using public water sources. So again, we're visiting households near those water points. We ask them, is your water today from any of these places, so we can match them up. And then we considered different factors of those water points, being what type is it, does it have reliability issues based on our data collection, observations, measured water quality, and also the distance, how far away is it? Okay, so getting into the results a bit. This is just kind of background to show you the spread of our data. So these are each district. The blue is wet seasons as defined by that definition, and the red is just when did we collect the data. So usually we were pretty within wet and dry. There's a couple overlap where we kind of missed the dry season, so that's where these dates of start and end became particularly important. But we're about half and half overall. And then I wanted to describe a bit about the water point sample. So it's about a third shallow groundwater, so that's springs and shallow wells. Almost a third piped water of different varieties, a quarter boreholes with hand pumps, and then a little bit of surface water and rainwater as well. And overall, I mean, most of them had water available when we visited, so it wasn't so bad, 86%, and this is, again, repeated visits over a few years. And looking at water quality, it was about 1/3 that were free from contamination. So we do see kind of, high prevalence of E. coli in these places, and variety. Boreholes with hand pumps are pretty good. And then, surface water, we probably aren't surprised that that's like basically zero that had safe drinking water. One second. Okay, so we found that the odds of water being available in the dry season were 15% lower overall. And so this plot is, that dashed line in the middle is the odds ratio of 1. So if it's right on that 1, it means there's no difference. Anything to the left is saying it's kind of worse in the dry season. Anything on the right is better. So, we see this was driven by sources in 2 of the settings, 2 of the countries. And shallow groundwater, we also saw a big difference. But the piped water and the boreholes were actually pretty resilient to these seasonal shortages in these locations. Now looking at the water quality, so E. coli contamination, we also see a change here, a little bit larger. So we saw 37% higher odds of being free from contamination in the dry season compared to the wet. Again, 2 of the country settings had bigger effects than Ethiopia was less so. And in terms of the different water point types, boreholes with hand pumps and shallow groundwater and piped water to a lesser extent were sort of driving those differences. All right, so then the second research question again is about household preferences. So we saw, kind of similar graph. So, the households, high level here is households primarily preferred water sources close to their homes. Okay, we're not probably surprised by that either. But that was the biggest driver we saw in this decision model. One thing that I was actually a little surprised about is a preference for boreholes with hand pumps and shallow groundwater over piped water systems. Less preferred, we see sources with reliability issues, higher E. coli levels, so we looked at 10 CFU or greater, and then, again, the distance. So those ones are kind of like the lower, on the left side. Also, surface water was less preferred than piped water. And then looking at those by season, so we split it. The preferences for the different source types were actually more pronounced in the dry season compared to the wet season. And so again, that preference for boreholes with hand pumps and shallow groundwater was the orange dots are more significant in the dry season as compared to the wet. But the other factors like distance, the quality, reliability, those things were not dependent on the season. Those were consistent. All right, so just to summarize here, so again, most of our sampled water points did have available water. So we're not talking about settings that have like very extreme examples of dryness. So it kind of depended, year to year, but when we look overall, it was 86% with, water that we could turn on and get a sample from at all our visits. But water quality is still a challenge, so only 1/3 were free from E. coli. Again, in the dry season, water was less often available, but more likely to be free from contamination. And we see this a little bit actually also with the specific water point types. There's some, like let's say shallow groundwater, more likely, or surface water, maybe more likely available, but worse quality. And so this is where I think we get into these trade-offs of, how do we make infrastructure that is able to be both high quality and available all the time. So I think we're starting to see some of those challenges here. And then finally, household source selection was primarily driven by distance, so less than 500 meters away, followed by reliability issues and then water quality. And this is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. We're trying to bring water closer to people's homes, so this makes sense. And in terms of the dry season was kind of, again, more prevalent with preferences for different water source types. And I just want to speak a little bit to some future work. We do have more data. We have one more round to add to this. There was a note on my slide about the household preferences as well. We want to add cost data, so we know that is also, people make decisions based on money. So we've added that into our surveys for the last round, so we hope to add this to the model. And hopefully someday also looking at extreme weather events now that we have all the climate data, precipitation data downloaded. So I'm happy to take questions. I'll also like to acknowledge the funder, the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. So thanks.
Amazing data set. So much interesting insight. I had a question about your preference analysis. So when I've thought about this in the past, one of the challenges that I bump into is to really consider, it's not a long list of alternatives that a household necessarily has. And so I always would have a hard time knowing, well, what is the preference truly? Because it has to be relative to alternatives that they find reasonable or feasible, and so I wonder how you're thinking about their comparison of alternatives when you're talking about preferences. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way that in the decision model, it actually allowed the preferences to be the other alternative water points that are in their community. So basically, for every household, we have this set of water points within a reasonable distance. And so we sort of assigned those different factors about reliability and water quality, et cetera, to each of the water points that they hypothetically could go to. And then, so the model was actually looking at their selection from these real examples. I had some other point, I forgot it, but yeah. All right, thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the water.
So next presenter is Jung Ecklu, Advancing Monitoring for Carbon Finance Water Security, Methodological Innovation and Insights from East African Projects. Can you see that? Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And I want to say thanks to everyone for sticking around to Thursday and to the last set of verbal presentations. I appreciate that you chose this one, and I'm glad I'm coming after Hemali and Anna. I think they give really good perspective to what I'm about to share. Once again, my name is John Ecklu, and I'm with the Mortensen Center in Global Engineering and Resilience at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm currently a postdoctoral associate there, and I'll be sharing some research on the work we are doing on climate-financed WASH projects in East Africa. And because I'm going after Hemali, I don't have to give a lot of background, but then there's a huge water gap. About 4.4 billion people still lack access to safely managed drinking water services. And if you've been here for any time throughout this conference, you've heard that there's also a huge financing gap. And if you've been around this year, that gap is growing. And so there's a water challenge, and like Hemali said, climate change is making things worse. So dry places are getting drier, wet places are getting wetter. And on the other hand, the water sector is also contributing to climate change. So about 10% of anthropogenic emissions also come from the water sector. And when we talk about the water sector here, we talk about in the broad sense. So all the way from the energy that's needed to treat and transport drinking water and wastewater to emissions that come from rice paddies. And so there's a water problem that's being made worse by climate change. And so that's where the voluntary carbon market comes in. It's been touted as a solution that helps to provide results-based financing to the water sector, but at the same time reduce emissions from the sector. And maybe a lot of you might know how it works already, but I'll just give an overview of how these kind of projects work. So it usually starts with projects that sequester emissions from the atmosphere or avoid emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Those emissions are monitored, reported, and then verified by third-party auditors. Once they've been verified, the projects are then issued carbon credits. Those credits are then sold to organizations or individuals seeking to offset their emissions. And then the revenue from those sales are then used to maintain existing projects or to fund new projects. In the water sector, the idea is that biomass and fossil fuels can be replaced with clean drinking water services. But I'd like to pause here to acknowledge that there are criticisms with these kind of projects. One of the main ones being that, in actual fact, most people are not boiling water. Typically, you find that about 20% of people are boiling water and about 80% are just drinking water that is not clean. And so it raises an important question. Are these kind of projects really leading to significant reductions in emissions? And that's a genuine concern. But I like to say that the concept of suppressed demand that allows for this seeks to address the fact that in a lot of these low and middle income countries, the demand for energy is suppressed by things like poverty and underdevelopment. And so what it does is that it estimates the amount of energy that will be used if just the basic drinking water services of these communities are fully met. And in addition, it's important to know that in a lot of these countries, they are the least responsible for climate change, but then they are often the ones least equipped to deal with its impacts. And so it also works as a form of an adaptation tool that allows these communities to partake in a climate market that they would have otherwise been excluded from. But that's not the focus of my discussion today. Today, I'll be sharing information from some projects we are working on. We are working on 5 projects doing research on 5 projects across Africa in 4 countries, but today we have data available from 3 of those projects. So the first one is from the Amazi Meza project in Rwanda, the Life Straw project in Kenya, and the Asili DRC project, the Asili project in DRC, sorry. And our guiding research question is, do select climate finance projects in East Africa lead to statistically significant improvement in microbial drinking water quality at the point of consumption? And I'd like to note that all these projects were registered under the methodology known as Gold Standard. A bit more about these projects. So the first 2 projects, the Amazi Meza project in Rwanda and Life Straw project in Kenya, are water filter projects. So they are being implemented in schools, and the estimation is that the carbon revenue from these projects will contribute towards CapEx and OpEx costs. And Asili, the water project is a pipe network that is periodically chlorinated, and the idea is that revenue from that project will go towards operation and maintenance of the system. In terms of data, we got our main data source was microbial drinking water quality test, and we are looking particularly at E. coli. And we got data from our baseline surveys and our monitoring surveys. At baseline, water sources pre-intervention were tested, and at monitoring, water from, in the case of the first 2 projects, from the filters in the classrooms were tested. In the case of Asili, water in the households that was fetched from the water point or water kiosks were tested. And so to some results. For the first 2 projects, you can see here that for the Life Straw project in Kenya, at baseline, about 15% of the drinking water sources were safe, only 15%. And then post-intervention, about 85% of the water samples taken were safe. For the Amazi Meza project in Rwanda, at baseline, only about 20% of the drinking water sources were safe, and then post-intervention, over 95% of the drinking water samples taken were safe. And so we ran a multinomial logistic regression, and what we found was that post-intervention, schools had significantly lower odds of higher E. coli risk levels compared to baseline. And just to put that simply, what that means is that the interventions led to statistically significant improvements in microbial drinking water quality. We saw similar results for the project in DRC. At baseline, only about 5% of the drinking water sources were safe, and then at monitoring, we found that a surprising 100% were safe. So that was great. I'll get into more of what this means. But we also looked at maintenance records for the Amazi Meza project in Rwanda. And we saw that across all the schools, all the schools had maintenance records. That means that every single school had been visited for one maintenance event or the other. And going into detail, 62% of the filters needed repair and were repaired, and the others didn't. And the repairs were mainly on things like taps, internal tubing, and filter cartridges. In terms of use, during the monitoring visit, we found that over 98% of the filters were in use. However, about 11% of those needed repair. And the probable reason for the discrepancy is that although 11% needed repair, it seemed that most of those repairs are minor repairs, so they're still being used, although they needed repair. And so I'm going to touch on a bit of what this means. And for us, one of the first questions we asked was that, well, if you pour water into a filter, you expect the water coming out from it to be clean. So, like, what does that really mean, you know? But then that's why we also looked at the maintenance records. Filters degrade over time, deteriorate over time, and if you don't maintain them, the water quality coming from the filters is not going to be maintained. It's not going to be good. And so the maintenance records show that if these filters had not been maintained, would have probably seen worse water quality. And the reason why they were maintained was because the projects were incentivized to make sure that all these filters were working, because if they were not working, they wouldn't earn any carbon credits. Another point we noticed was for the Asili project in DRC, we saw really high improvement in drinking water quality. And we believe that part of that reason is because they were incentivized to ensure that the water quality remained clean. And it's interesting, a couple of weeks ago, they ran another water quality test, and the results dropped slightly from 100%. And because of that, they are currently mobilizing to do a hygiene campaign and to do a container cleaning campaign, because they're concerned that if their water quality drops below a particular threshold, they can't earn any carbon credits. So there's that motivation to make sure that these systems are still working well. And I'd like to note that it has also created a shift in implementer behavior. You will note that for most implementers, water quality monitoring is not a thing that they do a lot. Actually, I'm glad during this conference, I've been hearing a lot more about water quality monitoring, which is encouraging, but then typically most projects do not monitor for water quality. And in fact, all the partners we were working with had not been monitoring for water quality until they were required to do so by the methodology. And so that's a good improvement in behavior. And then finally, for the filter projects, it presents a scalable model, because these were two projects implemented in two different countries by two different implementers using a similar model, and they both showed strong improvements in drinking water quality. So in conclusion, the study demonstrates that climate finance water interventions can reliably improve microbial water safety across schools and communities, thereby advancing both health and development outcomes. Thank you. And I'd like to thank our funders and our partners, and even in particular, the enumerators that helped gather all these water quality and testing data. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I kind of missed the timeline. I know you had it on there on the slide for the baseline to the follow-up. Like how long had the filters been distributed?
So, and that's why I said I loved your presentation, because you give a better idea of what longitudinal data will look like. But for these projects, for the first one, filters were installed in July 2024, and then second tests were done in September. For the second project, filters were installed over a long period of time, starting from May 2023 all the way to May 2024, and then the follow-up tests were done in January 2025. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So it's like from 6 months to a year and a little bit.
Right.
So, okay, so my follow-up question is then with the carbon financing, how does that work? So you have one time point. Like a filter that's 6 months old, great, it works well. But as time goes on, we see people stop using them, maybe they get fouled, maybe, things happen. So is there like repeated requirements for the
Yes,
monitoring after, and what does that look like?
Currently, it's yearly, but we find that the implementers try to do it more than yearly because if you do it at the yearly point and then you miss your thresholds, you're not going to get any credits at all. So they're motivated to ensure that at the time of testing, they're able to pass those thresholds. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. A great presentation. Also
Thank
on
you.
the financing side, so I guess in principle, like if the filters work for a long time or the chlorine works for a long time, enough money keeps accumulating and it could pay for the whole intervention, or it could be profit making, or it could heavily subsidize. So like the scale of the funds that are being received, are they contributing a small portion to subsidizing the cost, or are they like approaching paying back for the investments, or how? What's the scale of the financing that's being
Okay,
received?
and that's a great question. And I presented here, so it varies by project. For some of the projects, the funds that come are able to cover CapEx and OpEx, and that was mainly for the water filter projects. But for the Asili projects, like the capital investment is really huge, and so most of the funds come in are just for operation and maintenance. But then the other factors that come into play, like how many people are you serving? Because the number of people, how big your intervention is, affects how much carbon credits you can gain. And there are costs associated with actually registering your project, monitoring it, and getting it audited. And so if you're not at a huge enough scale, you might not be able to have enough money. It might not be worth your while. So some of these projects are running at scales like over 300,000 beneficiaries plus. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
So next presenter is Resham. Is that correct? How I pronounce? Resham? Resham Jung Singh. Sustainability of water, sanitation, hygiene systems in Nepal, an analysis of people's perceptions on climate change and management perspective of wash systems. Which one is yours here? Okay, just in the present mode, it's going to show that. You have to see.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Good evening, everyone. Most probably, I'm the last presenter of this conference. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm from Nepal. I'm Resham Singh. And you can see the topics of my research and presentation, like sustainability of wash systems in Nepal, an analysis of people's perceptions on climate change and management perspective of wash systems. It's basically, the research is based on the perception analysis. So I'd like to continue. In the introduction section, we people in this room are all aware about the climate change and what happened all over the world, and Nepal is also facing the climate change impact. So all those literatures I have mentioned here, there are different literature which are related to climate change, global climate change trend, and climate change trend in Nepal, and what is the situation, what are the issues Nepal facing, like the sustainability of rural wash system remains a challenge in countries like Nepal, because the constructing and building the water supply or wash system is continuously going ahead, but the sustainability is the biggest challenge nowadays. Similarly, another one issue we have is this data is as of 2018, published by the Department of Water Supply and Sewage Management Nepal. As of that date, around 42,000 water supply systems constructed or implemented all over the country. But the data shows that only 28% water supply systems functioning well, and remaining 38% require repair and maintenance. And repair and maintenance are more likely due to cause of climate-induced hazards, flooding, landslide, damage the water supply system. Similarly, the spring, in our context, spring source is the major water supply source, especially in the mountain, hill, and mid-hill area. The spring are the major source of water in mid-hill area Nepal. There has been a steady depletion in spring water source around 30 in over 30 years. These are some research findings and other as well I mentioned here. And the problem of statement is climate change threatens the resilience of rural water supply and sanitation services, as I already mentioned. Limited studies have been conducted to identify, to evaluate the climate change impact directly on the water supply system. There are many research have been done to identify the other aspects. So this is the one of the research gap, and another one is it need to emphasize more investment in the resilience building and action-oriented research required. These are some problem of statement I mentioned here, and adaptation and climate hazards results, all those things. And my PhD research, there are 4 research questions, but my presentation is more focused on the second question: what are the impacts of climate change on community managed waste system? The conceptual framework of this research question number 2 is to identify the climate change impact on water supply system. You can see the conceptual framework and the relationship between the different variables, like independent variables, high temperature, low rainfall intensity, and high rainfall intensity. I categorize in the 3 independent and moderating variables. The drought, landslide, and flooding are the byproduct of the independent variables. And then what are the impacts? Like dependent variables are water source depletion, water source drying up, and water quality deterioration. And finally, all 3 dependent variables impact on the water supply system, like in the water quantity, water supply, and water quality. And ultimately, the overall water system's functionality and sustainability is impacted. So today's my presentation is more focused on functionality and sustainability. This is the overall research framework. Due to time limitation, I will not go to the other part. You can reach out to my paper as well. This is the study area. Like you can see, Nepal has a different type of physiographic region, topographic region, and I adopted 3 different study area of 3 different topographic, physiographic region. So we can see there, and from the different 3 provinces, and you can see the spatial distribution of the respondents as well in the 3 different area. And this is the methodology flowchart for this particular question number 2, to identify the impact of climate change. The questionnaire survey has been conducted with the water users community members and the maintenance worker of the water supply system. And similarly, the 3,000, around 4,000 tap stand also assessed through the perception analysis, and another one is around 400 water supply source also assessed by the perception analysis. And other, I also mentioned the data, the relationship analysis, like regression analysis of the independent and dependent variables, moderating and dependent. The relationship is between independent and moderating variables, and moderating to dependent variables. So all those things, methodology and data analysis process I mentioned here. And moving towards the result and discussion, you can see the climatic pattern of last 30 years of the 3 research area. First one is one station of one area, and second you can see another one, and third one is three different area, different like precipitation, Tmax, maximum temperature and minimum temperature, how the trend has been evolved in the past 30 years. So in an average, you can see that the results reveal changing the climate trends patterns in the form of a shift in the seasonal temperature and rainfall pattern. So increasing trends in the maximum and minimum temperature and decreasing rainfall in different physiographic regions. So overall precipitation pattern has been decreasing, but temperature, Tmax and Tmean both are in increasing trend. So what I think the result also somehow aligned with the global trend as well. Similarly, this is unpublished result, but I would like to share, because I have already published first paper regarding objective number 2, research question number 2, but this is how analyzing about the climate extreme and projecting the climate, future climate. How you can see how the climate in previous present slide, you can see the 30 years back trend of the climatic parameter, but this slide shows that how the climatic pattern will be happen in the next 75 years, like near future, mid future and far future. So you can see there the precipitation is almost same or decreasing, it's in a fluctuating trend, and temperature you can Tmax and Tmean both will be increased in the rapid trend. So that was the extreme scenario. In the result discussion and conclusion, based on the people perception, erratic and intense rainfall cause floods and landslides, and less rainfall and high temperature cause drought. And what this research also identified, that perception analysis is supported by the climatic time series data analysis as well. Similarly, respondents reported that out of 338 water sources, 63% of water source showed depletion, and 5% of water source already dried up, and affecting due to those regions, affecting the water availability, reliability, and quality. Out of 3,896 tap stands, only 32% are well functioning, full functioning, and 62% are partially functioning, and the remaining are not functioning. The functionality indicator is I have taken from the indicator developed by the government of Nepal, and based on those indicators, I assessed the functionality. The functionality consists of 3 indicators: quantity, quality, and supply. Similarly, the highest level of the distribution of waste systems occurred in the pre-monsoon and monsoon season disruption. The highest level of disruption of waste systems occurred in the pre-monsoon and monsoon season. The major reason behind the disruption in the pre-monsoon season is water source depletion and drying up, and the monsoon season due to the flood and landslide. That's the finding. And another one, seasonal turbidity influences 62% of water quality. Seasonal means it's like monsoon season. 62% of water quality, and climate-induced phenomena such as flood and landslide damage waste infrastructures, and drought diminish the water source, adversely impacting the waste system functionality. And in my research, the water quality, regarding the water quality, I just considered the turbidity only. I have not gone through the other biological contamination, only turbidity is considered. This is the final findings regarding the sustainability. You can see in the chart that respondents experience that financial, institutional, environmental, technical, and social fits indicator have a constant that further embedded the sustainability system, and only 3% of waste systems are achieving satisfactory sustainability performance level, and 74% achieving average, and 23 performing poorly. It means 103 waste systems were assessed during this research, and out of 103, 3% of waste systems only achieving the satisfactory performance level. A recommendation, moving toward the recommendation, for making climate resilient waste system, climate impacts need to be assessed with proper climate projections and climate resilient structure need to be developed, enhancing the adaptive capacity of the community people, and FITS indicator need to be regularly assessed and necessary actions need to be performed to improve their performance level, especially the environmental and institutional component. These findings offers insights for policymakers and practitioners in formulating strategies for developing climate resilient water systems in Nepal. You can reach out to this link as well if you want to see or learn about the details about this research finding. Recently, IWA Journal for Waste for Development has published this paper. This is the paper, and this is my contact details. Thank you so much. If you have any comment, feedback, and questions, please.
Thank you very much. I had a question as to how you defined, or the respondents defined satisfactory sustainability. Like and when you were talking about the systems that reach those percentages, what's the definition of sustainability, I guess?
Thank you. Sustainability, I referred many literatures. To assess the sustainability of water supply system, we need to consider 5 indicators: financial, institutional, environmental, technical, and social aspect of whole water supply system. So I just make the 43 indicators to assess those FITS indicators. Like, for example, for financial, I ask around 5 to 7 questions, and for institutional, 7 to 8. And I gave the weightage of all the indicators, components. Not myself, but I discussed with the WAS professionals, WAS panel of experts, and I discussed, and we came to the conclusion that my research is more focused on climate resilience than environmental and technical component should have higher weightage, and then other should have lower weightage. But in this way, we assess the sustainability of the water supply system. Yeah.
Thanks. It's very interesting. I have 2 questions for you. So you showed 2 related data sets, one about 2/3 of tap stands being non-functional, presumably because of water resource depletion, not because of operation and maintenance.
Yeah.
And then the other one is changes in temporal trends for precipitation and temperature. And I wanted to have you explain a little bit first how those changes in precipitation and temperature are linked to the springs drying up. Yeah. And if that is the case, second question is there any intervention that can be done to mitigate this, or is it just a question of like, we need to find something other than springs for water supply in these areas?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you so much. Regarding first question, due to time limitation, I have not mentioned all the information here. You can just check with my article as well, because to identify the climate change trend based on the perception and based on the time series data, both analyzed and both validated. Like time series data results and the people perception is somehow aligned. So we can say that the climate change issues is happening, like climate temperature is increasing, Tmax is increasing, Tmin also increasing. Then at the same time, what is happening at the field? Like we ask question for the water source status and the tap functionality status and all those things, and we linked each other. By the analyzing the regression analysis, you can see the relationship between those indicators in the conceptual framework. This conceptual framework, you can explain about that. All the variables has been asked by the questionnaire, like a Likert-Iskall questionnaire we developed. Like, for example, high temperature, what is the perception of people? And what are the regions of drought? We asked with the local people. And what is the region of water source depletion? And is the drought, or is the landslide, or the flood? And in this way, the relationship between variables has been assessed and analyzed by using the regression analysis. Yeah. And another one is this is sorry for second question. If I properly get the question, this is my PhD research, and the research findings has been published, and we can implement the learnings from this research in the coming days to make the climate resilient WAS. I properly answered or not? Second question. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you once again.
We still have a few minutes, and if you have some remaining questions from the previous presenters, there's a chance for that now. No? So I think everybody wants to drink some wine and relax. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Last session, now let's enjoy ourselves.
Thank you.
That makes me so happy that you said that. So the position that I'm at University of Richmond, that I just started 2 months ago, is an undergrad. It's a small liberal arts college, so I teach undergrads. So this is like huge validation that you're giving me. Like, okay, the stuff that I'm saying is making sense. Because one thing that this conference is really